Also in the UK, King Charles III has made his youngest brother, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh. The title was last held by their father, Prince Philip, from 1947 until his death in 2021.
The palace corridors were supposed to be quiet after the mourning of the late queen. The dust of succession settled, the crown firmly placed on the head of the eldest son, but suddenly a hidden clause exploded like a thunderclap through the House of Windsor, and insiders whisper that King Charles was left absolutely furious when lawyers revealed that a section buried deep inside Queen Elizabeth's private legal documents quietly transferred even more valuable assets to his youngest brother, Prince Edward. For years, Charles operated with a certain certainty, a quiet but powerful assumption that the most valuable personal pieces of the late queen's fortune would naturally flow to him as the eldest son, the heir, and now the king. That belief had shaped decisions behind palace walls ever since Elizabeth passed away in 2022. Staff treated certain estates as if they were already under Charles's authority. Advisors moved around assets, discussions took place about income streams, maintenance, management, and future royal planning. It all seemed normal. After all, royal tradition often favors the firstborn, the crown absorbing much of what came before. But behind that comfortable assumption, something else was hiding, something written years earlier in a legal document that almost nobody outside a very small circle had examined closely enough. The moment came quietly, not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, but with a piece of legal correspondence that reportedly landed on the desks of royal advisors. Edward's legal team had been reviewing the sealed estate instructions for months, combing through language that many believed had already been interpreted correctly. And then there it was. A clause, small, precise, impossible to ignore. A clause that insiders say clearly outlined that certain private assets purchased personally by Queen Elizabeth were not meant to pass into Charles's control at all, but were instead intended for Prince Edward. At first, the discovery sounded almost absurd. Palace aides reportedly believed there must be some misunderstanding, but as the wording was analyzed again and again, the reality became impossible to dismiss. The clause did not merely mention Edward casually or symbolically. It reportedly specified property rights, personal holdings, and a set of investments that had been assumed for years to be under the king's eventual authority. And suddenly, everything changed. Because if the clause held legal weight, then Charles had been operating under a false assumption this entire time. Sources close to the palace say the reaction was immediate and tense. Charles, who had already structured parts of his post-succession planning around certain financial expectations, was reportedly stunned that a hidden instruction from his mother could redirect those assets elsewhere. The king had always respected the late queen, but the idea that a quiet legal detail could alter the balance of inheritance inside the royal family triggered a wave of frustration inside the palace. Advisors were summoned. Documents were reviewed. Legal experts were asked one blunt question again and again. Is this clause real? And does it actually transfer control to Edward? The answer coming back from lawyers was uncomfortable. The language appeared legitimate. It was not a vague suggestion or a ceremonial gesture. It was a legally binding instruction tied to privately owned property that Elizabeth had purchased in her own name decades earlier. Unlike crown estates such as Balmoral or Sandringham, which have complicated institutional connections to the monarchy, these particular holdings fell into the category of personal assets. And that distinction made all the difference, because personal assets can be distributed exactly how the owner wishes. And according to the wording uncovered by Edward's lawyers, Elizabeth had wished them to go to Edward. The implications were explosive. For months, possibly even years since the Queen's death, Charles had allowed these assets to be managed under the assumption they were his responsibility as sovereign. Financial returns may have flowed through structures aligned with the King's office. Maintenance decisions had been approved. Advisors had treated them as part of the broader royal financial ecosystem. Yet the clause suggested something shocking. Those assets were never meant to be under Charles's authority in the first place. What made the situation even more dramatic was Edward himself. For most of his life, he had been seen as the quiet brother, the one who avoided confrontation, the royal who never seemed interested in challenging the hierarchy of the family. But the involvement of lawyers changed the dynamic entirely. Once legal documentation entered the conversation, this was no longer a matter of family courtesy. It became a matter of rights, property, and legal ownership. What followed inside palace walls was a tense and uncomfortable period of legal clarification, quiet negotiations, and the unmistakable realization that something much bigger than a simple family misunderstanding had unfolded. Because once Edward's lawyers formally presented the clause and its legal implications, the royal household could no longer treat the matter as speculation or rumor, but as a genuine question of ownership that demanded resolution. And sources close to the situation claim that Charles initially struggled to believe the interpretation, convinced there must be some loophole, some technical wording, some legal nuance that could restore the assets to the king's authority. Yet the deeper the lawyers dug into the late Queen's estate documents, the clearer the situation situation appeared to become, because the clause was reportedly precise, deliberate, and written in language that left very little room for reinterpretation, meaning that certain private estates, financial holdings, and personal collections Elizabeth had accumulated during her lifetime were not automatically flowing upward to the monarch as tradition might suggest, but instead were directed specifically toward Edward, a detail that stunned even seasoned royal advisors who had assumed the inheritance pattern would follow the predictable hierarchy of royal birth order, and the emotional ripple through the palace was immediate because this discovery quietly reshaped the internal balance of the Windsor family, forcing Charles to confront the uncomfortable reality that his youngest brother might suddenly control assets the king himself had believed were part of his extended financial sphere. What made the moment even more complicated was the timing, because Charles had only recently solidified his authority as monarch and had already begun organizing various financial and property matters tied to the crown's broader operations, and the idea that a hidden clause could reverse assumptions that had guided those arrangements created a logistical and reputational puzzle the palace had to solve carefully and quickly, since a public dispute between royal brothers over money would instantly ignite global headlines and feed the tabloids with the kind of dramatic royal infighting the monarchy has spent decades trying to avoid. And so the initial strategy from Charles's advisors reportedly focused on quiet verification rather than confrontation, reviewing the clause again and again, comparing it against other sections of Elizabeth's will, consulting estate experts familiar with the complex categories of royal wealth, which include crown property, institutional holdings, and strictly personal assets, because only the latter could be freely assigned to family members. And if the clause referred to those personal holdings, then the legal ground beneath Edward's claim would be extremely solid. Meanwhile, Edward himself remained characteristically restrained on the surface, continuing his royal duties without public comment, attending events, meeting organizations, and maintaining the calm image that has defined his reputation for years. Yet, insiders say behind the scenes his legal team had become increasingly confident that the clause left little doubt about the Queen's intentions, and they reportedly informed palace representatives that Edward was not seeking confrontation, but simply expecting that the assets his mother had chosen for him would be acknowledged and transferred according to her wishes, a position that placed Charles in an awkward corner because challenging the clause would risk appearing as though the king was disputing the will of the very monarch he had just succeeded, something that could raise uncomfortable questions about respect for Elizabeth's final decisions. As discussions progressed, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from disbelief to reluctant acceptance, because legal advisors confirmed that the clause had been properly documented within the estate framework, and that ignoring it could potentially create a far larger legal issue than quietly honoring it. And so negotiations began focusing on how to unwind the practical side of the situation, including evaluating the properties involved, calculating any income generated since Elizabeth's passing, and determining how management responsibilities would be transferred from structures aligned with Charles to those associated with Edward, a process far more complicated than simply handing over keys or bank accounts, because royal assets are often connected to trusts, historical protections, and long-term financial arrangements that require meticulous legal adjustments before ownership can officially change hands. For Charles, the personal dimension of the situation was perhaps even more frustrating than the financial one, because the king had spent his entire life navigating the expectations attached to being the eldest son, the heir, the Prince of Wales, and finally the sovereign, and discovering that a quiet clause could bypass that traditional path and empower the youngest sibling instead reportedly felt like a direct contradiction of the hierarchy that had defined the royal family for generations. Yet at the same time, advisors reminded him that Elizabeth had always been meticulous in her planning and rarely left matters of inheritance to vague interpretation, suggesting that the clause may have been written intentionally years earlier with the precise outcome now unfolding, a possibility that only deepened the intrigue surrounding the late Queen's private intentions. Within royal circles, the story began circulating in hushed conversations as one of the most unexpected inheritance twists the family had experienced in decades, not because the assets themselves would dramatically alter the monarchy's overall wealth, but because the discovery revealed how fragile the assumptions inside even the most powerful families can be when legal documents are finally examined line by line. And as the transfer process slowly moved forward, it became clear that the relationship between Charles and Edward would never quite return to the quiet simplicity it once had, because Edward had demonstrated that even within the rigid hierarchy of royalty, legal rights still matter, and Charles had learned that the final authority over certain family matters still rested with the decisions Queen Elizabeth made long before anyone imagined her carefully written clause would one day ignite such a dramatic moment inside the House of Windsor.